let's say good evening to Dr. Viv Newman from the University of Essex. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks very much indeed.
Good to have you with us. Now, Viv, you're Essex through and through.
I am indeed. I'm proud of it. Essex girl, I'm proud.
Excellent. That's what we like to hear. And you just published a book called We Also Served the Forgotten Women of the First World War.
That's right, yes. And really, the book is answering the question that maybe people have asked about their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-aunts, their cousins. What did you do in the Great War, Mummy, Granny, Great-Granny? Because we all tend to know what our male ancestors did in the Great War, but we tend not to be quite so sure about what the women did.
Well, it was a time, we've moved on since then, although some may disagree, but generally we like to think that we've moved on in terms of equality since then, but during the First World War, it was a man's world, wasn't it? Which is, I guess, why we tend to hear about those stories. But you've been uncovering the forgotten, as the name in the book implies, the forgotten stories.
Yes, and what I've tried to do is I've tried to look at very much at ordinary women who, when war broke out, really didn't necessarily know, some women didn't know that they had a role or that there was anything that they could do in the war. But very soon it became obvious that there were lots of tasks that they could fulfill, lots of jobs, lots of roles that they could get involved with. But first of all, they had to convince the male establishment that their service was every bit as important and every bit as necessary as the boys who rushed to the colours to enlist.
So how did they do that? How did they convince the top brass that what they were doing was just as important as the boys on the front line?
Well, to begin with, the top brass thought that the only thing that women could do was knit, and I'm in no way am I going to do I decry their knitting effort, because that was absolutely fabulous, and in fact Lord Kitchener asked women to knit 300,000 pairs of socks by November, and in fact they had knitted 1 million. So I do actually look at the knitting as the war effort, and very much if the soldiers' lives depended in many instances on women's knitting. So there is quite a section in the book that talks about knitting. But that's not the only thing that women did, far from it. And I tell the story of the doctor in Edinburgh who was convinced that as a doctor and as a surgeon, she had a part to play in the war effort. So she rushed to the Royal Army Medical Corps head office in Edinburgh, offered her services as a trained doctor or nurse, and she was told, "My dear lady, go home and sit still."
Which is just incredible, because you've got a trained surgeon, a medical professional, a doctor here offering their services.
Exactly.
And they're turned away because she's a woman.
She was told to go home and sit still. Well, the one thing that you couldn't tell this particular lady to do was sit still. She didn't really approve of sitting very much. And so what she did was she gathered together a group of other women doctors, nurses, drivers, and she simply decided that if the British didn't want her, she would offer their services to the Serbs and the French medical services, who were desperately short of medical staff. And in fact, it is exactly 100 years ago tomorrow, 27th of November, she wrote a letter to the French and Serbian ambassadors in London and offered to fund and found a hospital unit, and that they would go and serve in France and Serbia. And being slightly more open-minded than their British counterparts, the French and the Serbs immediately accepted her services, and by the beginning of December they had founded and had started to open a hospital in Royaumont in France, not very far from Paris, in an abbey that was totally unsuitable, but the women transformed it into one of the most magnificent hospitals with one of the finest records of any hospital in the First World War.
So this woman offered her services to her country, they turned her away, and then she ended up offering them to the French and the Serbs, and they took her on. Is that an accurate? Do we know is that an accurate reflection of women's rights in the respective countries at the time? Were they, like you said, that they were more open-minded, but were they in France and Serbia?
No, they were desperate.
Right.
And they began to see that they were so short of medical services that it would be foolish to refuse an offer from a group of trained doctors and nurses, and they were actually open-minded enough to be gender blind, to use a modern term.
Even if their intention wasn't honest, they at least could see that, look, forget about what women should do and what men should do. This is just about resources.
Exactly. And our soldiers are going to be wounded. Our soldiers are, already they were suffering terribly from casualties, and in Serbia the dying were lying next to the almost dead, and the completely dead. They were three to a straw mattress, and they just realised that they could not cope. And so when Elsie offered her services, they just thought, well, we just definitely do need doctors desperately.
Fantastic.
And so a whole group, a lot of English and British not doctors and nurses actually served in Serbia. And still, on the 14th of February every year in Serbia, there's a memorial service recognising and acknowledging the contribution that British women made to the Serb army. Yes.
Oh, really?
They actually commemorate them.
That is amazing.
Which is an amazing story.
Yeah. So you've got a medical contribution to the war effort. Maybe not for Britain, but for Serbia and France.
Yes.
Yeah. In that example, medicine. So in what other ways did women contribute to the war effort? Apart from knitting, obviously we've done knitting.
Yeah, we've done knitting. Yes. So, and obviously, I think most people probably know about the munitions workers, and they started to go into the factories in 1915. And there's actually quite an interesting twist to the munitions story, in that we all know about the boy soldiers the boys who rushed to enlist underage and lied about their age in order to serve with the colours overseas. What people often don't realise is that the girls were also lying about their ages. They had to be 18 to serve in the danger sheds in the munitions factories. That was to handle the explosives. And the girls would lie about their age in order to be able to work in what they saw as the most demanding and the most necessary of areas in munitions work. And there's one quite interesting story about a girl who did lie about her age. She was 17 and she managed to convince the staff that she was 18, and they allowed her to work in a TNT shed, or danger shed as it was called. And in fact there was a terrible explosion, and she was very, very severely wounded. She ended up losing her leg. Only 2 women survived. They were rescued by female firefighters, because there were women firefighters in the munitions factories. But this particular woman was badly injured, had her leg amputated. Then she requested dole money from the government, compensation which was paid to munitions workers who were seriously wounded, and she was told that as she had lied about her age, she wasn't entitled to any dole money. And in fact they gave her the OBE, but she never got a penny by way of compensation. Quite simply, she was told she'd lied about her age.
She got an OBE but no money.
She got an OBE and no money, and she was told that she wasn't the government's responsibility because she shouldn't have been there in the first place. Thank you very much.
I don't think the word injustice accurately sums up that situation. It's fascinating stuff. I know you've got loads more stories which I want to get through. Dr. Viv Newman is here. She is a historian and expert in the role that women played in World War I. Any questions for yourself? Dr. Viv Newman, an expert in the World War. Viv, we've been through the role that women played in World War I, not just for this country, but also for Serbia and France. We talked about medicine, knitting, munitions workers. You mentioned that some of the girls used to lie about their age so that they could work in the factories. Do we know the age of the youngest girl?
I believe that girls as young as about 14 were actually working in the factories. Some of them were not in the danger sheds. They were working in less dangerous occupations, because of course really anything that a soldier needs is a munition of war. We tend to think just in terms of guns, but of course anything that a soldier needs, including uniforms, boots, the socks of course, and food, is a munition of war. So some of the girls were working in a much more legal role, but really a little bit like the boys wanted to go to the front, the girls wanted to be in the danger sheds. That was where they really felt that the main contribution to the war would lie.
Okay.
And of course it wasn't only the doctors, it wasn't only the munitions workers, but we do actually have our very own Essex nurse, who was an incredible character.
Oh, yeah.
And
does she have a name?
She does indeed. Her name is Kate Luard,
Okay.
And she was a veteran of the South Africa War, because remember, England had been at war just a decade earlier, and Kate had actually served with great distinction in the South Africa War.
This is the Boer
Wars, yes. And she had earned a name for herself as a very, very competent nurse. She was a member of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, and when war broke out, in the very, very early days in August, she went back over to France to serve, and then in September she was one of the early nurses to serve on ambulance trains. Now, these were trains that went up to very, very close to the battlefields to load the casualties. And at the very beginning, the first weeks of the war, it was felt that they wouldn't have nurses on the trains. They would just be orderlies and members of the Royal Army Medical Corps who were very willing, but they hadn't got nursing training. And then it was felt that the casualties and the wounds were so horrific that they would try and see whether it was a good idea to let women go on the trains. And of course women rose to the challenge of nursing on these trains, which at the beginning were very, very primitive. And Kate, in her letters and her diary, actually writes about the trains, and they weren't walk-through. Each carriage was completely self-contained, and the only way that the nurses could move between the carriages on their journeys through France was actually to claw their way along the footboards outside.
What, climb along the side?
Climb along the side of the train.
Like a stuntman
Or
woman.
Absolutely. And don't forget, they were wearing long dresses. They had dresses down to the ground. They would claw their way along with a backpack, if you like, it's the only way to describe it, of medical equipment, very often also clutching a hurricane lamp so that they could actually see their way to move between the carriages.
So holding on with one hand and a backpack and a lamp.
And a lamp, yes, and probably trying to hold their skirts up so that they didn't trip over them.
Of course, yeah.
And actually moving, and it was the only way that they could get between the carriages to nurse the men and the wounded. And although it was forbidden, they were told not to do it, the matron-in-chief of the Queen Alexandra's Military Nursing Service in France basically turned a blind eye because she felt that her nurses had to do what was necessary to help the wounded. And so, in fact, she overlooked the fact, even though she was quite a disciplinarian, she overlooked the fact that these women were breaking all the rules because the boys needed the nursing care.
Nurse Kate, we salute you.
Absolutely.
And all the women who were climbing around trains so they could get from carriage to carriage. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff.
All in the book.
Well, yes. And what amazes me as well, Viv, is that you're telling me these stories, no notes, no script. You remember it word for word. Where have you found all this information from?
Well, Kate, there's a lot of information about Kate actually in the Essex Record Office, but most of my information and research has taken place at the Imperial War Museum, which was founded in 1917 to provide information and to give people access to stories, documents, books about the First World War and all subsequent conflicts. And it is the most amazing resource for historians, very welcoming, expert archivists and librarians. And the terrible news is that the library is under threat of closure. Under threat of closure. The library is threatened with being closed.
This is for financial reasons?
This is for financial reasons.
And what will they do if they close it? Where will they move that archive? Will it still be publicly available somewhere?
No, I think the collections and some of the documents will probably survive, but the books that are actually in the library, some of which are obviously totally out of print, or if they do exist, are astronomically expensive and most people couldn't possibly afford to buy them. The book collections will be sold off, and we will lose probably the finest collection of First World War and all subsequent conflicts. It's not just the First World War, the Imperial War Museum, it's all conflicts since the First World War have a home there.
It's a fantastic museum.
It's an amazing museum, and the museum isn't under threat of closure, but it's the library and the expertise of the staff.
So when we say every year, lest we forget, it's places like this that make sure we don't.
Exactly, and there's generations of historians, battlefield guides, authors, and just the interested public who have been welcomed there and have been helped and informed and educated. And once we lose that resource, then I question how many more historians will be able to research the war to the extent that we've been able to at the moment, and obviously subsequent conflicts.
Where can people go to sign a petition?
There is an online petition, and people can easily access it. It's very easy. All you need to do is just click on bit.ly/save_IWM, or if you just put into a search engine IWM Library, and you'll be taken through to the petition. And please sign it, because it's the only way, really, that we can make obvious how precious this resource is.
It's a connection with our past, isn't it? It's another connection with our past, and it needs saving. Just finally, Viv, because we're running out of time, what's your one favourite story, or one... I know you must have hundreds, maybe even thousands. What's your favourite story about a woman in World War I?
I think it probably depends on the day of the week or my thoughts, but let's go this day for a Suffolk lady, which is not far away, is it? Just up the road.
That's all right,
Suffolk.
that's all right.
And she was the only woman who is known to have borne arms in the First World War, and she actually fought her way from 1915 right the way through the war with the Serb army, and she remained in Serbia at the end of the war, and she actually had a brush with the Gestapo in the Second War, because she joined up again in 1939, though she did admit once she'd packed her bottles of vodka and her 500 cigarettes into her kit bag and marched off age 60, she said she was a little more reluctant this time round.
Oh, bless you. And what's her name?
Her name is Flora Sandys, and she's another amazing character, and I tell her story in the book, along with those of countless other women. But if you'd asked me tomorrow, I would have probably said somebody different.
Still there, Flora Sandys.
Flora Sandys, Sandes.
As the only woman to have served on the front line in World War One.
World War, yes.
The whole of World War One,
Yes.
and she was an English woman fighting in Serbia.
She was indeed. She started off as a nurse, and she ended up at the end as a sergeant major, and was one of the most decorated of all Serb soldiers.
Wow. That's a great story. Viv, unfortunately, this programme only has 15 minutes left, and we've got to do some other things. I really wish that this programme would go until 10. Frankly, I think so do many of our listeners, and producer Stuart, and certainly myself. But we've got to leave it there. The book is out now.
It is indeed, and I'm actually going to be at Waterstones in Chelmsford on Saturday between 10 and 5, signing the book. If anybody's got stories they want to tell me about the First World War, I will be there, desperate to make notes, and you never know, the story might get into the next book, because there are plenty more in the pipeline.
Go and see Viv at Waterstones. The book is We Also Served the Forgotten Women of the First World War, and while you're at it, go online and sign that petition to save the Imperial War Museum Library. Viv, thank you so much for coming in. Dr. Viv Newman, expert in the role of women in World War I. Thank you.
Thank you.